guys, welcome to my channel. Today I have two Dollar Tree fall DIYs. The first one I'll be showing you is a pumpkin topiary, and the second one is a reverse canvas framed leaf. Both of these DIYs were super easy to make. If you want to see how I created them, then just keep watching. The first DIY for today is this pumpkin topiary, and for this project I'll be using 3 pumpkins from Dollar Tree, 2 of the velvet and 1 burlap. I'll also be using a 4-inch terracotta pot, Americana chalk paint in the color Lace, folk art chalk paint in the color Castle, paintbrushes, burlap and lace ribbon from Dollar Tree, raffia, nautical rope, scissors, Spanish moss, a 6-inch grapevine wreath, an old sweater for my fabric, and my hot glue gun. I'm starting out by painting my terracotta pot and my chalk paint in the color Castle, and I did only have to do 1 coat of this paint. I'm also painting on the inside of the pot so that you can't see any of the original color. Once my paint is dried, I'm then taking my chalk paint in the color Lace and I'm dry brushing that over top of the Castle color. Once I have my pot all painted, I'm moving on to my pumpkins. I'm removing all of their stems, and on the 2 velvet pumpkins, I'm removing the fabric, and then on the burlap pumpkin, I'm just removing the stem and I'm leaving the fabric as is. Next, I'm painting a stem from one of the velvet pumpkins. I do only need 1 stem for this project, and I'm painting that in the chalk paint color Castle, and then once that's dry, I'm dry brushing it with the color Lace. Now moving on to my pumpkins, I'm placing a pumpkin from one of the velvet pumpkins in the center of my sweater, and I'm cutting around in a circular shape. I didn't use measurements when cutting this circle around my pumpkin. I just cut it very large, and I knew that I could always cut off any excess later on. With my pumpkin centered in the middle of my sweater fabric, I'm then pulling up the sides of the sweater and then I'm poking it in the hole that was in the top of the pumpkin, and I'm using the end of a paintbrush to do this. This works really great to get the fabric nice and tight. I'm working in sections with my fabric. I'm pulling a small amount up and then I'm using the end of the paintbrush to push it in the very top hole of the pumpkin, and then continuing this step until the pumpkin is completely covered in the sweater fabric. I have my pumpkin all covered in the fabric, but since I didn't measure in the beginning, I did have some extra. So here I'm just using my scissors to cut some of the extra fabric off the top, and then I'm using the end of my paintbrush once again to push the extra fabric down into the top of the pumpkin, and then I'm using a little bit of hot glue and pushing the fabric down on top of it so that everything stays in place. For this pumpkin, I'm going to be adding some nautical rope along the sides, and here I'm measuring around the pumpkin, and then I'm cutting 5 different pieces of nautical rope to glue onto my pumpkin. Make sure you use some good sharp scissors because the nautical rope is hard to cut through. To attach the rope, I'm using some hot glue on the top of the pumpkin, pulling the nautical rope down to the bottom of the pumpkin with some more hot glue, and I'm continuing this step for all 5 pieces of the nautical ropes. After all of my ropes are attached, I'm going to be setting this pumpkin aside until we start creating the topiary later in the video. Moving on to my second pumpkin, I'm going to be using the burlap and lace ribbon from Dollar Tree, and here I'm cutting a triangle shape at the very top of my ribbon before I place it on the inside of my pumpkin, and I'm using a little bit of hot glue to attach it, and then I'm bringing it down on the bottom of my pumpkin and I'm cutting another triangle just so that it lays a little bit better once I have it all hot glued down. Again, I'm cutting the end of my ribbon into a triangle shape so that it's easy to put into my pumpkin. I'm placing some hot glue on the inside of the pumpkin and then placing the ribbon over top to attach it, pulling the ribbon down, cutting the end of that into a triangle shape, and then putting some hot glue on the pumpkin and placing the ribbon over top to attach it to the pumpkin. You don't have to cut the ends of your ribbon into a triangle shape. I just find that it helps the ends lay down a lot better this way. Once the ribbon is completely covering my pumpkin, I'm going to be setting this one aside for later in the video and moving on to the third pumpkin. For this pumpkin, I'm leaving the original burlap fabric. I'm taking some hot glue, placing it on the very top of my pumpkin, and then putting a piece of raffia over top of that, wrapping it around the pumpkin. I'm cutting the raffia at the very top and then hot gluing the end of that down. I'm then taking a second piece of raffia and I'm doing the same thing I did to the first one. I'm placing some hot glue on the top of my pumpkin with the raffia over top, wrapping the raffia around the pumpkin, cutting off the excess and then gluing the end of the raffia down. Now I'm going to be attaching all of my pumpkins. I'm placing some hot glue around the top of my ribbon pumpkin since that's my bottom one, and then I'm putting my sweater pumpkin on top of that, holding it for a minute so it stays in place. Then placing some hot glue on the top of my sweater pumpkin and placing the burlap one on top of that. Again, I'm holding it for just a minute so it stays in place. I forgot to leave a hole for my stem, so here I'm just using some scissors to cut a new one in my raffia and then placing the stem on the very top. Next, I'm taking my grapevine wreath and placing it around the edge of my pot and then placing the pumpkins on top of the pot. To attach the wreath to my pot, I'm using a little bit of hot glue on the sides and then just pushing the wreath over top of the glue. Once that's all attached, I'm then placing hot glue right onto the wreath, and then I'm placing some Spanish moss on top of the glue so that it sticks to the wreath. I'm also going to be placing Spanish moss in between all of my pumpkins where they meet together, doing the same step of placing some hot glue right on the pumpkin and then placing the Spanish moss over top of that to attach it. Next, I'm making a bow out of a piece of raffia, and here I'm not doing anything special, I'm just making a bow like if you would tie your shoes, and then I'm cutting off any of the really long end pieces. Now that I have my bow all made, I'm going to be attaching it to the very top of the burlap pumpkin using some hot glue. For the last step, I'm trimming my Spanish moss so that it looks a little bit more put together and not so messy. This is the finished topiary. I'm so happy with how it turned out, and it fits with my decor in my home perfectly. Now for the second DIY, it is this reverse canvas framed leaf. For this project, I'm using two Dollar Tree canvases, a 5x7 and a 6x8. One leaf ornament from Dollar Tree. Americana chalk paint in the color Lace. Waverly chalk paint in the color Maze. Folk art chalk paint in the colors Castle and also in the color Java. Paintbrushes, wood filler, Spanish moss, a utility knife, my hot glue gun, and some sandpaper. To start out, I'm taking my utility knife and I'm cutting around all of the edges of the canvas so that it's easy to take the canvas off of the wood frame. Once I have my canvas cut all the way around, I'm using my fingers to pull the canvas apart and off of the frame. The edges can sometimes be tricky, so you might have to go over them a few times with your knife. And I am only going to be using the 5x7 canvas. I have the main part of my canvas off, and instead of taking the staples out to get the extra canvas off of the back, I'm just pulling it through the staples because sometimes the staples can be tricky to get off. Next, I'm painting both of my frames with my chalk paint in the color Castle, and I only had to do one coat of this paint. After my frames have been painted and the paint has dried, I'm then dry brushing my paint in the color Lace over top of both of the frames. Next, I'm cutting the canvas from my 5x7 frame down so that it doesn't overlap when I glue it on the back of the frame. Next up, I'm placing some hot glue around all of the edges of the 5x7 frame and then placing the canvas over top to attach it. I am using the more creamy side of the canvas instead of the really white side because I liked this a little bit better. Now I'm taking some hot glue and placing it on the inside of the 6x8 frame and then putting some Spanish moss over top of that to attach it, and I'm doing this around all four sides. After I have all of my moss attached, I'm then going to be placing hot glue around all of the edges of the 5x7 frame and then placing it inside of the 6x8 frame. Moving on to my leaf. This leaf is meant to be an ornament, but I didn't want there to be a hole, so I'm taking some wood filler and filling the hole. I'm letting that dry, and then I'm taking some sandpaper and sanding the wood filler off so that my leaf is nice and smooth. Then I'm taking my chalk paint in the color Maze and I'm painting over my entire leaf, and I am painting along all of the edges as well. Once my paint has dried, I'm then taking my paint in the color Castle and I'm dry brushing that over top of my leaf, but I'm focusing the paint along all of the edges of the leaf. Then I'm taking my paint in the color Java and I'm going over all of the places where I just painted the color Castle. This is going to give my leaf more dimension. Once I have that paint all on, and then I'm taking some hot glue, placing it along the back of my leaf and pressing it right in the middle of my canvas. There was a few empty spots in between the two frames, so I'm just filling that in with some more Spanish moss. For the very last step, I'm trimming my Spanish moss so that it doesn't look so messy and it's more put together. And this is the finished framed leaf and last DIY for today. Both DIYs were so much fun to create. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you're not subscribed, I would love it if you would subscribe. Be sure to hit that notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Thank you so much for watching.